Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm glad you decided to spend part of your evening here. Get comfortable wherever you happen to be. You may be listening from bed, from a quiet room after everyone else has gone to sleep, or through headphones while finishing something that should probably have been finished several hours ago. History has always been patient with people who stay up too late. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from tonight. What time is it there? Is your city still awake? Or has everything outside your window finally gone quiet? Tonight, we are going to Chicago. Not the Chicago of glass towers, crowded airports, deep dish arguments, and expensive parking. We're going back to the beginning of the 20th century, when the city was growing so quickly that streets, neighborhoods, fortunes, and political careers seemed to appear almost overnight. Chicago was loud, crowded, ambitious, and rarely embarrassed for very long. Factories operated beside homes, trains carried thousands of newcomers into the city, stockyards processed animals on a scale that visitors found difficult to describe politely, smoke hung over entire sections of the South Side, elevated trains rattled above streets filled with wagons, streetcars, pedestrians, salesmen, labourers, pickpockets, police officers, and people looking for work. Chicago wanted to become one of the great cities of the world. It also wanted to enjoy itself. Those two ambitions were not always kept separate. A short distance south of the respectable hotels, banks, department stores, and theatres of the central business district stood a neighbourhood known as the Levee. By 1900, its best-known section lay roughly between 18th and 22nd Streets, bounded by State Street and Armour Avenue, which later became Federal Street. Within those few blocks were saloons, gambling rooms, dance halls, cheap hotels, music venues, brothels, private clubs, and many establishments that combined several of those businesses under one roof. Some places were little more than poorly furnished rooms above taverns. Others had dining rooms, orchestras, expensive carpets, uniformed attendants, and wine lists intended to impress men who wanted to believe that paying a large bill made an evening respectable. The Levee served customers from very different parts of society. Labourers entered its inexpensive saloons. Travelling businessmen arrived from nearby railway stations. Visitors came from other cities after hearing stories about Chicago's nightlife. Wealthy men used private entrances and expected discretion. Politicians appeared often enough that their presence was treated less like a scandal and more like part of the operating expenses. People knew what happened there. Newspapers knew, the police knew, city officials knew. Religious organisations, reformed societies, neighbourhood groups and business leaders knew. The remarkable part of this story is not that Chicago contained a major vice district. Most large American cities had places where activities considered immoral or illegal were concentrated. The remarkable part is how openly the Levee operated, how thoroughly it became connected to city politics, and how long Chicago's government resisted shutting it down. The city did not simply fail to notice the district. Chicago noticed it, discussed it, mapped it, investigated it, collected money around it, sent police through it, and then allowed much of it to continue. That arrangement was not officially described as surrender. Officials often presented it as practical government. The argument worked like this: prostitution, gambling, illegal drinking, and other forms of vice could not be eliminated completely. Since they could not be eliminated, the city should attempt to contain them. If the businesses were concentrated inside a known district, police could monitor them. Respectable residential neighbourhoods could be protected. Families would not have to encounter open solicitation near their homes. Visitors looking for such entertainment would know where to go, and everyone else would know which streets to avoid. On paper, this could sound almost organised. In practice, it created a district where law enforcement became selective, political protection became valuable, and illegal businesses could operate as long as the correct people were paid, supported, or obeyed. Chicago officials had tolerated designated vice areas before the Levee became famous. As the central business district expanded, brothels and related businesses were repeatedly pushed away from valuable commercial property and moved farther south. The policy was less about ending vice than relocating it. In 1903, for example, the city acted against vice near the Southern Loop while leaving the newer district between 18th and 22nd Streets largely intact. This was how a city could claim to be cleaning itself while moving the same businesses several streets away. It was municipal housekeeping performed with a very large rug. The levee was not hidden at the edge of Chicago. That would have made the arrangement simpler to explain. It stood near major transportation routes and within reach of downtown. A visitor could spend the afternoon conducting business in the Loop, eat dinner in a respectable restaurant, attend a theatre performance, and then travel south to the levee without leaving the developed centre of the city. The district's accessibility was one reason it became profitable. It was also one reason it became impossible to dismiss as a remote collection of lawbreakers. The levee existed beside Chicago's legitimate economy, not outside it. Money spent there passed through property owners, breweries, food suppliers, musicians, cab drivers, clothing merchants, furniture dealers, landlords, and politicians. Saloons purchased large quantities of alcohol. Brothels bought linens, food, coal, clothing, perfume, and furnishings. Entertainment halls employed performers, waiters, bartenders, cleaners, doormen, and musicians. Some workers entered the district because it offered opportunities unavailable elsewhere. Some arrived through deception, coercion, poverty, addiction, or pressure from men who controlled their earnings. Others moved between restaurants, theatres, saloons, and sex work in an urban economy where a woman's wages in respectable employment could be extremely low. The district cannot be understood accurately as one large party. It was an economy. That economy produced pleasure for customers, income for owners, votes for politicians, revenue for surrounding businesses, and suffering that respectable Chicago often found easier to discuss in general terms than to examine closely. For many customers, the levee was a place they visited and left. For the people working there, leaving was not always so simple. It is easy to imagine the district only at midnight, when music was playing and the entrances were crowded. Its operation began much earlier. Deliveries arrived during the day, rooms were cleaned, kitchens prepared meals, bartenders stocked shelves, musicians reported for work, clothing was repaired, managers reviewed accounts, women were instructed on where to sit, how to dress, what to charge, and how much of their earnings they were expected to surrender. Police officers walked through the neighbourhood, but their presence did not necessarily mean that the law was about to be enforced. A uniform might signal inspection, warning, collection, or routine observation. A raid could be real, or it could be a performance arranged to demonstrate that officials had not completely abandoned their duties. Businesses sometimes received notice before enforcement actions. Owners learned which rules could be ignored, which had to be observed, and which people should never be offended. The levee developed its own form of stability. That stability depended heavily on politics. Chicago's first ward included an extraordinary mixture of wealth, commerce, poverty, lodging houses, saloons, gambling operations, and vice businesses. A contemporary description from 1900 called it a ward of sharp contrasts, containing major financial institutions as well as cheap lodging houses in the entire Levee District. It reportedly had fewer homes and more saloons than any other ward in the city. The ward's unusual population made its elections especially useful to political organisers. Many residents were transient. Some stayed in inexpensive hotels or lodging houses. Saloon keepers and precinct workers could help men register, find polling places, obtain food, receive small favours, and remember which candidates had been friendly. The relationship did not need to be explained in complicated language. A political organisation helped a man when he needed food, work, legal assistance, or a drink. When election day arrived, the man helped the organisation. Two aldermen became closely associated with this system. John Coughlin, widely known as Bathhouse John, and Michael Kenner, known as Hinky Dink. Together they built a First Ward political machine supported partly through money and influence drawn from the Levee saloons, gambling houses and brothels. Coughlin entered the city council in 1892, and Kenner joined him in 1897, during a period when each Chicago ward elected 2 aldermen. They were different enough to look as though someone had deliberately paired them for a stage comedy. Coughlin enjoyed attention, expensive clothing, public performances, and a reputation for extravagance. Kenner was smaller, quieter, and far more careful. He operated the Working Man's Exchange, a saloon where food, beer, conversation, and political organisation occupied the same space. Coughlin attracted notice. Kenner counted. Together they understood something important about the levee. The district did not merely need officials willing to ignore it. It needed officials capable of protecting the arrangement at City Hall, controlling ward politics, communicating with police, and making certain that business owners understood the price of continued operation. The result was not lawlessness in the usual sense. The levee had rules. They were simply not always the rules printed in the city code. Owners who paid for protection expected protection. Politicians who received money expected loyalty. Police officials expected cooperation. Reformers entering the district were watched. Journalists looking for scandal could be welcomed, misled, bribed, threatened, or given a tour carefully designed to show them exactly what the owners wanted reported. This system explains why repeated public outrage did not immediately close the district. A sermon could condemn the levee on Sunday morning, but the district would still open that evening. A newspaper could publish an investigation, but the businesses remained politically useful. A police chief could promise stricter enforcement, but officers serving in the area understood that certain establishments had powerful friends. A mayor could announce reform without deciding that every profitable resort should disappear at once. The language of reform often moved faster than reform itself. Chicago's residents were also divided over what should be done. Many people considered the district a disgrace and demanded complete suppression. Others feared that closing it would scatter prostitution across the city. Some businessmen worried about Chicago's reputation. Other businessmen quietly benefited from customers brought into town by that same reputation. Even people who disliked the levee could accept the argument that concentration was safer than dispersal. That belief allowed the district to survive. By the first decade of the 20th century, the levee was not a secret weakness in Chicago's government. It was a public compromise supported by enough officials, customers, business owners, and voters to resist repeated attacks. The city's behaviour resembled a landlord who complained constantly about a noisy tenant while continuing to collect rent. Chicago disapproved of the levee. Chicago also found uses for it. That contradiction could be seen most clearly after sunset. Imagine arriving near 22nd Street on an evening around 1905. Electric lighting had already transformed parts of the city, though illumination varied greatly from street to street and building to building. Signs directed customers towards saloons and clubs. Music escaped through doors whenever someone entered. Carriages stopped along the curb. Men stepped down, adjusted their coats, and looked around with the false casualness of people who had planned the visit all day. Street sellers, guides, cab drivers, and doormen knew how to identify newcomers. A well-dressed visitor might be directed toward one of the district's expensive houses. A labourer with only a few coins would be sent somewhere else. A man too drunk, too violent, or too visibly poor might be refused at one entrance and welcomed at another. Not every building appeared dangerous. That was part of the district's success. The most expensive establishments tried to remove any sign of disorder from the customer's immediate view. Rooms could be richly furnished. Meals were served. Music was performed. Staff members were expected to behave with careful politeness. The customer was invited to think of himself not as a man entering a brothel, but as a guest entering a private social club. The Everly Club became the most famous example. Ada and Minna Everly opened their establishment at 2131 to 2133 South Dearborn Street in February 1900. It was known for expensive interiors, music, dining, selective admission, and wealthy customers. Contemporary and later accounts described it as one of the most luxurious houses of prostitution in the country. The Everly was unusual, but its fame shaped how outsiders imagined the entire Levee. Newspaper readers heard about decorated rooms, champagne, orchestras, visiting millionaires and prominent guests. Those details made excellent stories. They also concealed the much larger world of cheaper establishments where conditions were harsher, violence was more common, and workers had far less control. Luxury gave the district a public face. Poverty kept most of it operating. The difference between the Everly Club and a small brothel behind a saloon was enormous, yet both depended on the same central arrangement. They operated within a neighbourhood where vice had been concentrated and where political influence could interfere with enforcement. One establishment used expensive furniture and strict admission policies. Another used a narrow staircase and a handwritten sign. The law had reasons to enter both. Political Chicago had reasons to hesitate. Outside the levee, reform organizations gathered evidence. Ministers warned congregations. Social workers met women whose experiences did not match the cheerful stories told by club owners. Physicians worried about disease. Families searched for daughters who had disappeared into the city. Investigators tried to determine how many businesses were operating and who benefited from them. The disagreement was not only about sex or public morality. It involved policing, poverty, immigration, women's employment, alcohol, public health, political corruption, and the limits of municipal government. Could a city regulate an illegal industry without becoming its partner? Could police collect information from vice businesses without eventually protecting them? Could politicians accept campaign support from saloon keepers and brothel owners while claiming to represent the public? Could the levee remain contained once automobiles, telephones, hotels, and new entertainment districts made private arrangements easier? Chicago postponed firm answers because the existing system was profitable and familiar. Then the pressure increased. In March 1910, Mayor Fred Buss appointed a 30-member vice commission to investigate prostitution in Chicago and decide whether segregated districts should continue. Some members initially considered regulated segregation a practical option. After gathering testimony and studying conditions, the commission concluded that the policy had failed and recommended that the districts be abolished. Its report, published in 1911 as The Social Evil in Chicago, examined the relationship between prostitution, saloons, police practices, low wages, public health, and the city's policy of containment. The report forced Chicago to confront facts that had long been available in fragments. Vice had not remained neatly inside its assigned boundaries. Regulation had not prevented exploitation. Political protection had weakened enforcement. The supposed solution had developed into a large commercial system that depended on the very government expected to control it. Even then, the levee did not vanish immediately. Famous establishments began closing, raids increased, owners relocated, changed methods, or moved their operations into less visible forms. By 1912, enforcement had largely shut down the concentrated district, but prostitution did not disappear. It moved into hotels, apartments, clubs, cabarets, and networks that were harder to locate on a city map. That outcome revealed the weakness at the centre of Chicago's long experiment. The city had treated geography as though it were a cure. Officials had drawn informal boundaries around a human market and hoped the boundaries would make the consequences manageable. When the streets were finally cleared, the market adapted. Before we reach that closing, however, we need to understand how the district had been built so close to the centre of Chicago and why vice kept moving south whenever respectable property owners decided it had come too near. The levee did not appear in one evening. It was placed there gradually. One street was cleared, another was tolerated, and businesses followed the path of least resistance. Police pressure in one neighbourhood became opportunity in the next. Landlords rented to tenants whom other districts rejected. Saloon keepers noticed where enforcement weakened. Political organisers recognised a new source of money and votes. Chicago did not build the levee with an official dedication ceremony. No mayor cut a ribbon. The city created it through relocation, selective enforcement, commercial expansion, and a long series of decisions that seem temporary when considered one at a time. To see how that happened, we have to leave the bright entrances of 22nd Street for a while and follow the businesses that came before them, as Chicago pushed its unwanted trades away from respectable blocks and toward a district where the city hoped they would remain. To understand why the levee took shape between 18th and 22nd Streets, it helps to forget the idea that Chicago discovered a vice district and then decided what to do about it. The order was almost the reverse. Chicago repeatedly decided where undesirable businesses would be tolerated, where they would be raided, and where they would be pushed next. The levee was the result of those decisions accumulating over several decades. When Chicago incorporated as a city in 1837, it had only a few thousand residents. It was a young transportation centre built around the river, the lake, and the expectation that trade would keep increasing. Men arrived to work on canals, docks, railroads, warehouses, construction crews, and shipping operations. Travellers passed through on business. Sailors and labourers were paid in cash, and often lived without families nearby. Saloons, gambling rooms, and prostitution developed close to the same streets where customers worked, slept, and waited for transportation. Early Chicago did not divide itself neatly into a respectable commercial centre and a distant criminal quarter. The city was too small for that. A rooming house could stand beside a store. A saloon might contain a gambling table in the back. Women selling sex worked in taverns, rented rooms, and small brothels near the growing business district. Another concentration formed north of the Chicago River, on sandy land near the lake, in an area known simply as the Sands. By the 1850s, the Sands had become associated with squatters, drinking, prostitution, and other activities that alarmed nearby property investors. In 1857, those investors persuaded Mayor John Wentworth to clear the settlement. City officials destroyed the district, but they did not destroy the market that had supported it. Imagine watching that operation from a nearby street. Buildings are being torn down, residents gather what they can carry, officials describe the action as a clean-up. Newspapers report that a notorious place has finally been removed. For a short time, the land appears orderly. Then the former residents and businesses go somewhere else. That became a familiar pattern. Closing one concentration of vice gave officials a visible success, while the activity itself shifted to another area, where rents were lower, political resistance was weaker, or police were willing to tolerate it. Chicago learned how to remove a district from valuable land without addressing the conditions that had created it. Property could be cleared, customers could not. The reason was partly economic. Chicago was growing at a speed that placed constant pressure on land near the centre. The city had 29,963 residents in 1850. By 1870, it had 298,977. 10 years later, the population exceeded 500,000, and by 1890 it had reached nearly 1.1 million. Every period of growth increased the demand for offices, warehouses, hotels, railway facilities, shops, and housing. A block tolerated as rough or marginal in one decade could become valuable commercial property in the next. Vice businesses were useful when they occupied cheap land and served customers without disturbing powerful neighbours. They became a problem when the land was wanted for something more profitable, or when their customers became too visible from a new streetcar line, hotel, station, or office building. This distinction is important. Public officials certainly heard sincere moral objections to prostitution and gambling. Churches, temperance organisations and reformers opposed them for religious and social reasons. Families complained about solicitation and drunken behaviour, yet enforcement often became strongest when vice interfered with commerce, property development, or the appearance of respectable streets. Chicago was not merely deciding what behaviour it would permit, it was deciding where that behaviour could be seen. After the Civil War, prostitution continued to expand along the southern edge of the central business district. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 then destroyed a vast portion of the city and forced a rebuilding effort on an extraordinary scale. The disaster did not create Chicago's vice economy, but reconstruction accelerated the competition for centrally located land. Office buildings, hotels, warehouses, stores, and transportation facilities returned on a larger scale. Businesses that respectable investors did not want nearby faced increasing pressure to move. The district that became known as the Old Levee or the Custom House Levee developed south of the main commercial core, centred around streets between Harrison and Polk and between Clark and Dearborn. The boundaries were never perfectly fixed. A vice district was not established by a clean legal line painted across the pavement. It was recognised through patterns of enforcement. One block contained open brothels and gambling rooms. Another contained ordinary businesses mixed with saloons. A third might be considered respectable during the day and very different after dark. The name Levee was commonly associated with the rough entertainment districts of river cities, and Chicago adopted it for an area that served travellers, labourers, gamblers, and men arriving through nearby railway terminals. Whether a customer knew the official street names mattered less than whether a cab driver, hotel porter, bartender, or station employee knew where to send him. Railway geography helped the district. Chicago's 19th century terminal stations were built around the edges of the central business district, keeping them close to downtown while producing a steady flow of people through surrounding streets. Travellers arrived with money, time between trains, and no local reputation to protect. A man who would not enter a brothel near his own home could behave differently in a city where nobody knew his family. The old levee offered anonymity before Chicago had fully developed the modern systems that make anonymity easy. A visitor could step off a train, leave his luggage at a hotel, and ask a porter where he might find entertainment. The porter did not require a long explanation. He might recommend a theatre, a gambling room, a saloon, or a house where music and alcohol were only the beginning of the evening. Many establishments depended on these informal guides. Cab drivers received money for delivering customers. Bartenders made introductions, hotel employees passed along addresses. Saloon keepers rented rear rooms or upper floors. Men moved through a network that did not need advertisements in respectable newspapers, because the city itself supplied directions through word of mouth. The businesses varied greatly. Some brothels occupied recognisable houses with a madam, several women, servants, and a sitting room. Others consisted of rented rooms above saloons. Streetwalkers worked near taverns and lodging houses. Gambling operations ranged from small games in back rooms to organised houses with professional dealers and political protection. Drinking, gambling, theft and prostitution overlapped, because the same customers wanted several forms of entertainment and because the same owners understood how to profit from them. This produced another problem that city officials preferred to describe as containment. Once vice businesses gathered in a known area, the neighbourhood became easier to police selectively. Officers knew the owners. Owners knew which officers expected payment. Raids could be used to discipline establishments that had stopped cooperating, fallen behind on protection money, attracted too much attention, or offended the wrong politician. The existence of raids did not prove that the policy was failing. Raids were part of the policy. An establishment might be closed for one evening, its employees arrested, and its owner fined. The newspapers could report police activity. Reformers could be told that the city was enforcing the law. After the legal costs were paid and the appropriate understandings restored, the doors might reopen. Chicago's tolerated districts operated because public officials and many private citizens accepted the belief that prostitution was a necessary evil that should be concentrated in poorer areas to protect the rest of the city. Selective enforcement made those concentrations possible, while intermittent raids helped police their borders and preserve political control. The phrase necessary evil performed a great deal of work for the people who used it. It acknowledged that prostitution was considered immoral without requiring anyone to eliminate it. It allowed officials to present tolerance as realism. It reassured respectable residents that the city understood their concerns, while telling them that complete suppression would only spread the problem. The argument usually focused on geography, rather than on the women inside the trade. Officials discussed houses, streets, districts, and boundaries. They rarely began with wages, coercion, violence, or the reasons women entered prostitution. A woman became part of a municipal problem once she appeared in a location the city wanted to protect. If she moved south, the problem could be declared reduced. This was particularly convenient because many women in the sex trade had little political power. Some were immigrants. Some had arrived in Chicago alone. Some moved between domestic service, factory work, restaurant employment, entertainment, and prostitution. Respectable employment available to women often paid poorly. A woman who lost a job, became pregnant, left an abusive household, or had no family support could find herself with very few options. Not every woman in the district had the same experience, and it would be inaccurate to describe all of them as either helpless captives or entirely independent businesswomen. Some earned more than they could have earned in domestic work. Some worked under madams who imposed debts for clothing, rooms, meals, and alcohol. Some were controlled by pimps. Some entered voluntarily and later found departure difficult. Others remained for a short period and left. City policy treated these different lives as one category that could be relocated. The same approach applied to residents of neighborhoods chosen to receive displaced vice. When brothels were pushed into poorer blocks, officials assumed that the people already living there had less ability to object. Their streets became a buffer protecting more influential property owners. A district described as segregated was not separated from everyone. It was separated from people with enough influence to keep it away. That is one reason the movement of Chicago's vice districts tells us so much about the city. The route was not random. It followed power. When investors wanted the sands cleared, the sands was cleared. When the central business district expanded around the Custom House levee, pressure increased there. When a street became important to transportation or commerce, visible prostitution suddenly became less tolerable. When the same businesses moved into a poorer area under the protection of ward politicians, suppression became more complicated. The city's map recorded these priorities even when official speeches did not. By the late 19th century, legitimate business was pressing into the old levee from several directions. Railroads controlled substantial property south of Van Buren Street. Warehouses and business blocks replaced older buildings. Custom House Place and nearby streets no longer seemed distant from respectable commerce. They were becoming obstacles to its expansion. A contemporary account from the late 1890s described the old district as being squeezed by railroad holdings and legitimate improvements, with its western edge forced east and ordinary business pushing southward. Chicago had seen this situation before. The district had become too central, too visible, and too valuable. The answer was not immediate abolition. The answer was another move. Pressure did not fall evenly across every establishment. Small operators without protection were easier to close. Streetwalkers could be arrested quickly. A brothel owner with political connections had more warning and more choices. She could move to another building, transfer the business to a partner, or reopen under a different name. A police order could therefore reshape the district without reducing the number of customers. If officers targeted one street while ignoring another, business followed the gap in enforcement. If an alderman offered protection farther south, owners had an incentive to relocate. If landlords near 22nd Street were willing to rent properties for vice use, a new concentration could form rapidly. The process did not require city officials to hold a meeting and announce that Chicago was creating a larger red light district. It only required them to enforce the law strictly in one place and loosely in another. Mayor Carter Harrison Jr. provided clear examples of this approach. In 1897, he ordered police to clean up part of South Clark Street after prostitutes became visible from a new trolley line. The concern was not that prostitution had suddenly appeared. The concern was that ordinary passengers could now see it. In 1903, the city pushed vice out of the Southern Loop, while leaving the newer levee between 18th and 22nd Streets largely intact. A trolley had changed the acceptable boundary. That detail captures the policy better than a long official report. The women, saloons and brothels had been present before the line opened. Once commuters passed them regularly, the district no longer remained confined in the public imagination. Respectable Chicago encountered it through a window. Visibility created urgency. The relocation south also followed the city's changing scale. What had once seemed beyond the commercial core no longer felt distant. Chicago kept expanding, and each expansion brought more land into competition. The city was continually moving its unwanted businesses toward an edge that did not remain an edge for long. By 1900, the new levee had taken recognizable form between 18th and 22nd Streets, with State Street on the east and Armour Avenue, later Federal Street on the west. Its resorts range from expensive brothels to poorly furnished rooms in boarding houses and the rear spaces of saloons. It became one of the nation's most notorious sex districts, not because Chicago had failed to control where vice operated, but because the city had concentrated so much of it in one place. The move solved several short-term problems for officials. It cleared valuable streets closer to the loop. It gave police a known area to watch. It reassured property owners that open vice was being removed from their immediate surroundings. It also placed the businesses inside a ward where political organisation could turn them into a reliable source of money and influence. The new district had space, customers, transportation, and protection. It also had neighbours. Families, labourers, shopkeepers and tenants lived near the same streets that outsiders described only as a playground for visiting men. They encountered drunken customers, music, fights, solicitation, police activity, and rising commercial pressure. Their homes rarely appeared in stories about the levee, because those stories focused on scandal. Yet the Vice District was not an isolated compound. It was part of a living section of Chicago. Customers could arrive for one evening and leave with a story. Residents woke up there the following morning. The city's containment policy depended on ignoring that difference. Officials spoke as though vice had been moved away from the public, when it had actually been moved toward a different public. Soon, the concentration became large enough to require more than casual tolerance. Owners needed predictable protection. Police needed to know which establishments were connected. Politicians needed a way to collect support without allowing disorder to interfere with revenue. The levee could not become a stable empire until someone organised the relationship between illegal business and legal authority. That work would be handled by two aldermen whose names became inseparable from the district. One liked expensive clothes, public attention and speeches. The other preferred a small saloon, quiet conversations and careful arithmetic. Chicago had sent its sins south, and Bathhouse John Coughlin and Hinky Dink Kenner were preparing to show the city how profitable that decision could become. The new levee had businesses, customers, and a location the city had chosen to tolerate, but none of that guaranteed stability. A brothel could be open on Monday and raided on Tuesday. A saloon keeper could pay for a license and still be arrested for gambling in the back room. A police captain could issue a warning, a reform mayor could order a clean-up, and a judge could decide that the usual fine was no longer sufficient. Anyone making money from vice needed more than customers. The business needed protection from the government that officially prohibited it. John Coughlin and Michael Kenner understood that need better than anyone else in the First Ward. They did not look like natural partners. Coughlin was large, loud, social, and fond of being noticed. Kenner was short, quiet, and careful with both words and money. Coughlin dressed in expensive and sometimes startling clothes, enjoyed horse racing, wrote comic verses, and behaved as though every public appearance might become a parade. Kenner preferred a chair in the back of his saloon, where he could listen to several conversations, remember who owed a favour, and decide which request deserved an answer. Contemporary descriptions often treated them as a comic pair, but the partnership lasted because each man performed work the other did not do as well. Coughlin was born in Chicago in 1860 to Irish immigrant parents. He entered the bathhouse trade while young, working as a scrubber and attendant before opening a bathhouse of his own in 1882. The occupation brought him into contact with businessmen, gamblers, politicians, and men connected to horse racing. It also gave him the nickname that followed him into public office. When he was elected First Ward Alderman in 1892, Bathhouse John sounded less like an insult than a brand that voters already recognised. He would remain in the city council until his death in 1938. Michael Kenner had grown up in the same urban world but learned a different kind of politics. Born in 1858, he began working as a newsboy, later operated a successful newsstand and then moved into the saloon business. His nickname, Hinky Dink, made him sound harmless, which was useful for a man who preferred to exercise power without advertising every decision. Kenner won election as the other First Ward Alderman in 1897. Chicago wards were represented by 2 aldermen until redistricting changed the arrangement in 1923. So Coughlin and Kenner could hold the ward together without competing for the same seat. The First Ward made their partnership unusually valuable. It included much of Chicago's central business district, as well as the lodging houses, saloons, gambling rooms, and vice resorts south of the Loop. During the day, office workers, lawyers, bankers, merchants, and shoppers filled its streets. At night, the balance shifted toward travellers, labourers, entertainers, sex workers, gamblers, and men living in cheap hotels. The ward contained some of the most valuable property in the city and some of its poorest residents. It produced respectable business influence, large amounts of illegal revenue, and a population that could be difficult to count from one election to the next. An alderman in that period did more than debate citywide policy. He was expected to act as a neighbourhood representative, broker, employment contact, and problem solver. Residents came to ward politicians when a street needed repair, a relative had been arrested, a city inspector was causing trouble, or a man needed work. Chicago's early machines grew from neighbourhood networks in which political leaders exchanged access to jobs and services for loyalty at the polls. Saloons were well suited to this system because they were gathering places where people heard about employment, housing, legal problems, and local emergencies. Kenner's Working Man's Exchange turned that relationship into a daily operation. A man did not have to make an appointment or enter a formal office. He could walk into the saloon near Clark and Van Buren, buy cheap beer, eat from the free lunch counter, and wait for someone connected to the ward organisation. Men without much money could obtain food there. Lodging was available nearby. At registration and election time, the same men were expected to remember who had fed them and which candidates the organisation supported. A 1903 newspaper account of one of Kenner's expanded establishments described a room approximately 100 feet long, an 84-foot bar, 5-cent beer, soup and bread for hungry customers, and lodging rooms being prepared for hundreds of men. The report openly connected those rooms to voter registration. It also described the enormous amount of beer sold there, showing that Kenner's political headquarters was a highly profitable commercial business rather than a small neighbourhood tavern where a few supporters happened to gather. This was not charity in the modern non-profit sense. Kenner was building a political relationship. The food was real, and it mattered to men who were hungry. The help could also be real. A ward worker might find someone temporary employment, speak to an official, or direct him toward a cheap bed. The expectation attached to that assistance was equally real. When election day arrived, recipients were expected to vote correctly, and, when necessary, help bring other voters to the polls. To a reformer observing from outside, this looked like vote buying. To a man who had been refused help by respectable institutions, it could look like the only government office that opened its door to him. That tension helped protect Kenner and Coughlin. Their machine exploited vulnerable residents, but it also provided practical services that the formal city often failed to provide. Reform organisations could publish reports about corruption and urge voters to reject the ward bosses. The bosses could point to men they had fed, jobs they had arranged, and problems they had solved. A reform candidate might offer honest administration. Kenner offered lunch before the election and knew the voter's name afterward. The personal exchange of services for political loyalty was one of the central strengths of urban machine government. Coughlin handled the public side of the partnership. He attended events, made speeches, greeted supporters, and gave the organisation a recognisable face. He was not known for careful policy work, but careful policy work was not the main reason his supporters wanted him in office. His value came from loyalty, visibility, and his willingness to make the ward's interests heard inside the council. His flamboyance also made him easy to underestimate. Newspaper writers could laugh at his clothing and verses while he continued winning elections. Kenner did not need the same attention. He kept track of precinct workers, saloon keepers, lodging house residents, and business owners whose cooperation could determine an election. He understood that political control was built from lists, favours, payments, introductions, and turnout. Crowded ward containing many transient men required constant organisation. Someone had to know which lodging houses were full, which saloons were loyal, which precinct captain could produce voters, and which owner had become unreliable. Together, the two aldermen could speak to nearly every important interest in the ward. Respectable businesses wanted favourable city decisions and predictable streets around their properties. Poor residents wanted jobs, food, or protection from officials. Saloon keepers wanted closing laws applied loosely. Gambling operators wanted warning before raids. Brothel owners wanted police to leave their doors open. Citywide politicians wanted the first ward's votes. Coughlin and Kenner stood in the middle of those requests and charged different prices for different forms of help. The levy supplied the machine with its most dependable money. Brothels, saloons, and gambling houses operated in violation of laws that could be enforced whenever officials chose. That vulnerability made protection extremely valuable. An owner who paid the correct collectors could expect fewer disruptions or advance warning of trouble. An owner who refused could face raids, arrests, licensing difficulties, or sudden attention from inspectors. Historians of Chicago describe the First Ward organization as a political machine financed by graft and protection money from the levee's saloons, brothels, and gambling halls. The arrangement worked because corruption was distributed across several levels. The aldermen did not need to stand at the entrance of every resort and collect cash themselves. Intermediaries could gather payments. Precinct captains could communicate expectations. Police officers knew which businesses had political connections. Owners attended fundraisers and purchased tickets in quantities that had little to do with their interest in dancing. Money moved upward, favours moved downward, and responsibility remained difficult to place on any single person. When reformers asked why a particular brothel remained open, a police official could say that the evidence was insufficient. An alderman could say enforcement belonged to the police. A mayor could say that he had already issued general orders. The owner could insist that the building was a private residence, hotel, saloon, or entertainment establishment. Each answer allowed the business to continue while everyone denied direct control. The annual First Ward Ball made the relationship more visible than Kenner usually preferred. Tickets were purchased by people who needed the organisation's goodwill, including owners of businesses in the levee. The event raised large sums for the ward machine, and became notorious for its crowds, costumes, drinking, and open mixture of politicians with figures from the Vice District. It began in the 1890s and continued for more than a decade before reform pressure ended it, after the 1908 ball. The ball was unusual only because it gathered so much of the system into one room. The ordinary work of the machine occurred every day. A saloon keeper renewed his loyalty. A police officer ignored a violation. A precinct worker arranged help for a supporter. A business owner bought tickets. A voter received a meal. An alderman supported a favourable measure. No single exchange looked large enough to explain the ward's power, but thousands of such exchanges made the organisation difficult to defeat. Coughlin and Kenner also belonged to the larger culture of corruption inside the city council. Reformers called a group of predatory aldermen the Grey Wolves. These council members traded votes for favours and profited from decisions involving valuable franchises for gas, electricity, telephones and street transportation. One notorious scheme involved granting a franchise to the Ogden Gas Company, which existed mainly on paper, in an effort to force an established company to purchase its rights. Public anger over such practices helped produce the Municipal Voters' League in 1896. This broader council corruption mattered to the levee because it showed that the ward's protection system was not an isolated criminal arrangement operating beneath an otherwise clean government. City officials were making money from public authority in several ways. The same political environment that allowed aldermen to profit from utility franchises also allowed them to treat police enforcement as a negotiable service. Coughlin and Kenner were useful to stronger political figures because they could deliver votes. A mayoral candidate did not have to approve publicly of the levee to accept support from the First Ward organisation. Citywide politicians could promise reform during a campaign and still avoid a direct break with men capable of producing election workers, campaign money, and reliable totals from a complicated downtown ward. This gave the two aldermen leverage beyond their official positions. They were not mayors. They did not command the entire police department. They could not control every judge or newspaper. Their power came from making themselves necessary to people who held larger offices. The arrangement also explains why public ridicule rarely harmed them. Reform newspapers described them as corrupt. Civic organisations opposed them. Ministers condemned the ward. Opponents accused them of selling protection to criminals. Coughlin was challenged repeatedly and still remained an alderman for more than 4 decades. Kenner left the council, but retained his position as ward committeeman, controlling the political organisation, and later succeeded Coughlin as alderman after Coughlin's death. Their longevity was not produced by favourable publicity. It came from an organisation that continued functioning when headlines changed. Consider what an election in the First Ward looked like from Kenner's position. He did not begin by asking whether the newspapers admired him. He began with the precincts. How many registered voters lived in each lodging house? Which men had moved? Which saloons could serve as gathering points? Which workers needed to be reminded? Who controlled the men employed in a particular business? Which owner had purchased tickets and which one had not? How many voters required transportation? Which opponents were organising, and where? Election day was the final step in a process that had continued for months. A reform campaign often became most active shortly before voting. The machine had been active every day. That does not mean every First Ward voter was bribed or fraudulent. Many people supported the organisation because it represented their interests, because they distrusted reformers, because they valued personal assistance, or because party loyalty mattered to them. Machine politics succeeded by combining genuine loyalty with pressure, patronage, favours, and manipulation. Reducing every supporter to a purchased vote would make the system easier to condemn but harder to understand. The two aldermen also benefited from the social distance between reform leaders and many working-class voters. Civic reform organisations frequently drew support from businessmen and middle-class professionals who wanted efficient administration. Their goals could be reasonable, but their language sometimes suggested that poor voters, immigrants, saloon customers, and lodging house residents were problems to be managed. Kenner spoke to those men inside a place they already used. He did not ask them to become respectable before accepting their support. The price of that inclusion was obedience. A man helped by the ward organisation was expected to join its political network. A saloon keeper protected from enforcement was expected to contribute. A brothel owner allowed to operate was expected to pay and avoid causing a scandal that threatened the entire arrangement. The machine welcomed people whom respectable Chicago ignored, but it did not welcome them without conditions. Women working in the levee had even less influence over those conditions. Madams and resort owners could negotiate with collectors because they controlled businesses. Individual women usually could not. Protection money paid by an owner did not guarantee protection from violence, debt, disease, or exploitation for the women inside the house. It guaranteed that the establishment could continue earning. That distinction was easy for political leaders to avoid. Coughlin and Kenner could present themselves as defenders of a regulated district and argue that concentrated vice was preferable to prostitution scattered across residential neighbourhoods. They could claim that their policy kept order. From the street, an open resort with a doorman, lights and music might appear orderly enough. The more important question was what happened beyond the entrance. Political protection removed one of the few pressures that might have forced owners to change their practices. As long as payments were made and public disturbances were controlled, officials had little incentive to examine how women arrived, how debts were calculated, how earnings were divided, or what happened when someone tried to leave. The ward organisation treated each establishment primarily as a source of money and political support. This was how 2 elected aldermen ruled a district without owning most of its businesses. They controlled the relationship between those businesses and the city. They could not create customers, but they could reduce the risk of police interference. They could not guarantee that every owner would prosper, but they could make cooperation safer than resistance. They did not abolish the law. They decided how often it would matter. By the first years of the 20th century, their names were known far beyond Chicago. Visitors asked to see them. Reporters wrote about them. Reformers used them as symbols of municipal corruption. That notoriety did not weaken their authority inside the levee. It advertised the fact that the district had protectors who had survived every attack so far. The arrangement looked secure from City Hall and from the back room of Kenner's saloon. On 22nd Street it produced something more complicated. Expensive houses operated beside cheap resorts. Managers competed for customers. Musicians, waiters, bartenders, servants, cab drivers, gamblers, thieves and police moved through the same blocks. Women were displayed as the attraction, while owners, collectors and politicians divided the revenue created around them. To understand what Coughlin and Kenner were protecting, it is necessary to pass the doormen and leave the aldermen's public performances behind. The next streets were filled with businesses that sold very different versions of the same promise, from elaborate houses designed for wealthy visitors to rooms where almost every comfort had been removed to keep the price low. The businesses protected by Coughlin and Kenner did not offer one uniform experience. 22nd Street contained establishments designed for wealthy visitors, working men, tourists, gamblers and customers who had very little money. A man could enter a building with chandeliers, musicians, dining rooms and carefully dressed attendants, then walk a few blocks and find a poorly ventilated room behind a saloon, where privacy, cleanliness and safety received almost no attention. The levee's owners sold the same basic service at many prices, and the conditions inside depended heavily on what the customer could afford. By 1900, the recognised district stretched roughly from 18th Street to 22nd Street and from State Street to Armour Avenue, later renamed Federal Street. 22nd Street contained grand houses, small brothels, boarding house rooms, saloons with prostitution in the rear, and resorts serving interests that respectable newspapers usually described with cautious language. The district also included establishments where male prostitutes worked and saloons connected to Chicago's developing gay subculture. It was far more varied than the familiar picture of women standing beneath red lamps. Approaching the district at night, a visitor would have encountered music before he understood where it was coming from. Pianos operated in saloons and brothels. Dance halls hired bands. Doormen called to passing men. Cab drivers stopped near entrances where they expected a commission for delivering customers. Bartenders watched the street through windows and recognised police officers, regular patrons, strangers, and reform investigators. The district was open enough that a newcomer rarely needed to search for long. A hotel clerk, railway porter, bartender, or driver could offer directions. Some men arrived with friends who had visited before. Others came alone and tried to appear familiar with the neighbourhood. Employees positioned near entrances could tell the difference. That ability mattered because the levee depended on sorting customers. A prosperous businessman expected to be treated differently from a labourer carrying one evening's wages. A visitor wearing an expensive coat might be directed toward Dearborn Street and one of the district's elaborate houses. A man with little money would be sent toward a cheaper room or a saloon where the transaction took place quickly. Someone already drunk could be encouraged to keep purchasing alcohol before being offered anything else. Customers thought they were choosing among businesses. The businesses were also choosing among customers. The Everleigh Club stood at 2131 and 2133 South Dearborn Street and became the most famous house in the district. Ada and Minna Everleigh opened it in February 1900 after purchasing and remodelling two connected mansions. They presented the establishment as a private club rather than an ordinary brothel. Admission was controlled, prices were high, and the sisters promoted cleanliness, expensive furnishings, music, food, wine, and discretion. An evening there could cost $50, an enormous amount at a time when many workers earned only a few dollars for a long week of labour. The Everleigh sisters understood that wealthy customers were not purchasing only sex. They were purchasing separation from the visible disorder of the street. They wanted a doorman who could refuse undesirable visitors, a room where they would not be robbed, staff who would not reveal their names, and an environment that allowed them to pretend they were attending an exclusive social gathering. The club's rooms were decorated to support that impression. Promotional material described themed parlours, libraries, music rooms, dining areas, artwork, rich carpets, and elaborate furniture. The sisters employed musicians and presented the women of the house as carefully selected companions. Customers could eat, drink, listen to music, and spend hours inside before conducting the business that had brought them there. Much of what is remembered about the Everleigh Club came from the sisters themselves. They were skilled advertisers. They encouraged stories about distinguished guests, unusual rooms, expensive parties, and strict standards. Their establishment became famous partly because they understood that mystery was profitable. A customer who paid a large sum wanted to believe he had entered a place unavailable to ordinary men. Discretion was one of the club's most valuable services. A later newspaper account described how the sisters protected the identity of a wealthy customer who had left an unpaid note after an expensive private party. When an agent arrived with money to redeem it, the sisters denied that the man had ever visited. The story was repeated because it showed wealthy customers that the Everleighs understood the importance of silence. The women working there were expected to meet demanding standards. Ada Everleigh claimed that applicants needed previous experience, good health, an attractive appearance, controlled behaviour, and freedom from obvious addiction to alcohol or drugs. She also suggested that inexperienced women were undesirable because they were more likely to accept marriage proposals and leave. That explanation revealed the commercial calculation behind the club's polished image. The sisters wanted women who understood the business and would continue producing income. Working at the Everleigh could offer better surroundings and higher earnings than employment in a cheap house. It did not remove the underlying relationship. The women remained the product around which the establishment was organised. Their appearance, conversation, time, health and conduct were managed because wealthy customers expected consistency. The club's reputation often distorts the history of the Levees. It was exceptional precisely because most houses could not offer what the Everleighs offered. Thousands of customers never entered its doors. Many could not afford even a short visit. Most of the district's commercial sex occurred in places with far less decoration, privacy or control. Some houses charged only a few coins. Rooms were used repeatedly throughout the night. Bedding might not be changed. Washing facilities could be poor or non-existent. The same building could contain a saloon on the ground floor, rented rooms above, and a narrow rear space where customers were taken after purchasing drinks. Owners made money through volume rather than exclusivity. A section of Armour Avenue south of 19th Street became known by the insulting period name Bed Bug Row. It contained some of the cheapest houses in the district and was associated particularly with black women. The name described poor physical conditions, but it also reflected the racial hierarchy of Chicago's vice economy. Black women were often pushed toward establishments that charged less, offered fewer protections, and served customers excluded from or unwilling to pay for the expensive houses. Segregation shaped the district, even though customers crossed racial lines whenever they believed they could do so privately. White owners and politicians profited from black women working in degraded conditions, while respectable Chicago maintained rigid racial boundaries in housing, employment, and public life. A black woman had fewer opportunities in the legal labour market and less access to police protection. If she reported assault, theft, or coercion, officials could dismiss her because of her race and occupation. The city's tolerated district did not produce equal protection among illegal businesses. It produced a market in which expensive houses could purchase better treatment. Consider the difference between a customer at the Everly Club and a customer entering a cheap resort on Armour Avenue. The wealthy man was welcomed at a guarded door. His coat might be taken. He could order food and champagne. The establishment valued his continued patronage and protected his identity. A man entering a low-priced house expected speed. The room made little effort to create comfort because another customer was waiting. The women serving those men experienced the same difference from the other side. One might have a private room, clean clothing, meals, and access to a physician selected by the house. Another worked in a room where the owner expected several customers in rapid succession and deducted charges for food, rent, clothing, laundry, and alcohol. Debt could keep a woman attached to an establishment even when her earnings appeared high. A madame might advance money for dresses, shoes, cosmetics, medical treatment, or transportation, then record those advances as debts. The woman's income passed through the house before she received her share. If the accounting remained under the owner's control, the debt could continue no matter how much business she generated. Alcohol was part of the system because it created another source of profit. Customers were encouraged to buy drinks for women, often at inflated prices. The worker might receive a small commission, while the owner kept most of the money. In some establishments, women were required to persuade customers to purchase alcohol before taking them upstairs. The Chicago Vice Commission found prostitution closely connected to saloons, disorderly drinking establishments, dance halls, rear rooms, and rented spaces above licensed businesses. This arrangement allowed owners to profit before any sexual transaction occurred. A man could spend money on beer, wine, food, music, and admission. The woman's job included keeping him inside and increasing his bill. If he became too intoxicated to remember what he had spent, the establishment had little reason to correct him. The line between entertainment and prostitution was intentionally unclear. Freiber's Dance Hall at 18 East 22nd Street became one of the district's major resorts. Women met customers in the dance hall and could take them to rooms in the nearby Marlborough Hotel. Other businesses combined dancing, drinking, gambling, and prostitution so that every part of the evening produced revenue for someone. A visitor could enter intending only to drink and end the night in an upstairs room. A man arriving for gambling might be introduced to a woman by a bartender. A dance hall offered public entertainment while directing private business into nearby hotels. This was useful to owners because it distributed legal responsibility. The saloon keeper could claim he only sold alcohol. The hotel keeper rented rooms. The woman acted independently. The customer had made his own choices. In reality, the businesses often cooperated. Cab drivers participated as well. A driver who delivered a customer to a particular house might receive a fee. Hotel employees could be paid for referrals. Bartenders introduced strangers to women. Guides walked visitors through the district. This network allowed the levee to function as a coordinated marketplace without placing every transaction under one owner. The same network made exploitation easier. A newly arrived woman could be directed toward a job that was not what she had been promised. A customer could be led into a room where theft was expected. An intoxicated man could be moved between cooperating businesses until his money was gone. Stories of organized abduction and white slavery became a major feature of progressive reform campaigns. Some accounts were exaggerated, especially when newspapers wanted frightening stories about innocent white women being seized by foreign criminals. The language often carried racial and anti-immigrant prejudice. That does not mean coercion was imaginary. Women were recruited through false employment offers, pressure from intimate partners, debt, threats, and manipulation. The problem was more complicated than the popular image of a stranger pulling a girl into a carriage. The Vice Commission investigated what it called the sources of supply. Its report examined low wages, department store employment, domestic service, dance halls, saloons, employment agencies, family instability, and men who lived from women's earnings. The investigators concluded that no single cause explained entry into prostitution. Economic pressure, deception, previous abuse, personal relationships, and limited employment opportunities all contributed. Low wages were particularly important. Chicago offered women work in factories, laundries, restaurants, domestic service, and department stores, but the pay could be insufficient for rent, food, clothing, and transportation. Employers expected women to maintain a respectable appearance, even when wages did not cover the cost. A woman living away from family support could be one illness or lost position from serious trouble. Reformers sometimes treated low wages as though they mechanically forced women into prostitution. The reality varied. Most poorly paid women did not enter the sex trade. Many endured exhausting work, shared crowded rooms, skipped meals, or relied on relatives. Yet low wages narrowed the choices available when something went wrong. The levee offered immediate cash in a city where respectable employers could dismiss a woman without notice. Owners knew how to present that offer. A recruiter did not need to describe the most dangerous parts of the work. He could mention better clothing, easier hours, warm rooms, entertainment, and income greater than factory wages. A woman already working in a restaurant or dance hall might begin by accepting gifts or meeting one customer. The movement into commercial sex could happen gradually rather than through one dramatic decision. Once inside, leaving could involve more than walking through the door. A woman might owe money. She might have no place to live outside the house. Her family might refuse to receive her. A pimp or owner might threaten her. Police records and arrests could make respectable employment harder to obtain. Social stigma followed the woman more reliably than it followed the customer. Police surveillance increased that inequality. Women known to officers could be arrested repeatedly for solicitation or disorderly conduct. Customers were less likely to face lasting consequences. A man could enter the district, pay, and return to his home or office. The woman remained in the place where police expected to find her. The city maintained lists of known houses and women while claiming prostitution was illegal. One later account based on contemporary police figures described 119 houses and 686 registered women in the Southside Levee, while police counted 1,012 known prostitutes across Chicago. Civic investigators believed the real number was much higher. The Vice Commission eventually estimated roughly 5,000 women working through more than 1,000 resorts of various kinds. Registration did not make the trade legal. It demonstrated that police knew where it operated. That knowledge could be used to monitor disease, conduct raids, or locate suspects. It could also be used to maintain the boundaries of the tolerated district. A woman working outside the permitted area threatened the policy of concentration and might receive immediate attention. A house operating inside the levee with political protection could remain open. Health inspections offered another appearance of regulation. Some houses required examinations, and the Everleighs publicised their concern with health. Medical knowledge and treatment remained limited, however, and an examination could provide false reassurance. Syphilis and gonorrhea were serious risks. Effective antibiotic treatment did not yet exist. A physician could identify visible symptoms, but infection could be missed, concealed, or misunderstood. Owners had a financial reason to keep women working. A diagnosis that removed someone from the house also removed income. Customers wanted to believe that expensive surroundings meant safety, but expensive furniture did not prevent disease. The Vice Commission devoted a substantial portion of its report to the medical consequences of prostitution and rejected the claim that regulation had made the system safe. Physical violence was another constant risk. A customer could become aggressive. A pimp could take earnings by force. An owner could punish disobedience. Police officers themselves could demand money or sexual access. Women working in cheap houses had fewer employees nearby who might intervene, and reporting an assault could expose them to arrest. The Levee's public reputation emphasised male adventure. Newspapers and tourists discussed how much an evening cost, which celebrities had visited, and which house had the finest rooms. The injuries experienced by women rarely became entertaining stories, so they appeared less often. Visitors also came to look rather than purchase. Slumming became a form of urban entertainment for people who wanted to observe the district, while maintaining that they remained separate from it. Groups arrived with guides. Out-of-town businessmen asked to see famous houses. Respectable men could describe the visit afterward as curiosity about city life. Their curiosity still produced income. A guide expected payment. A saloon sold drinks. A cab driver collected a fare. Even the man who claimed he had only looked contributed to the economy that kept the district open. Reform tours operated differently but also changed the streets. Ministers, investigators, and settlement workers entered to document conditions or speak to women. Some offered practical assistance. Others arrived with fixed assumptions and treated every woman as a passive victim awaiting rescue. A woman who refused help could be described as morally lost, rather than someone making a calculation about rent, income, and the limited alternatives being offered. Mission homes and reform institutions could require strict discipline, religious participation, domestic labour, and separation from former associates. For a woman used to earning her own money, even under exploitative conditions, rescue could feel like another system controlled by people who made decisions for her. The contrast between the district's front rooms and back rooms explains why Chicago tolerated it for so long. From the street, officials saw concentrated businesses that appeared to maintain order. Doors were guarded, music played, customers entered voluntarily. Police knew the addresses. Politicians claimed the activity had been kept away from residential neighbourhoods. Behind those doors, the system was less controlled than its defenders claimed. It relied on debt, poor wages, alcohol sales, racial inequality, selective policing, and the ability of customers to leave consequences behind. The Everleigh Club made the levee look glamorous enough to attract national attention. The cheaper houses made it profitable on a much larger scale. Dance halls supplied customers, hotels supplied rooms, saloons supplied alcohol. Political protection supplied time. Every evening brought the same movement into the district. Streetcars unloaded men. Cabs arrived from hotels and railway stations. Musicians began playing. Bartenders filled glasses. Doormen made decisions at the entrances. Women prepared for hours of conversation, drinking, dancing, and work. Among the men moving through those rooms were police officials, businessmen, visitors, gamblers, and political workers. Once each year, many of them gathered with the aldermen, resort owners, entertainers, and thousands of spectators at an event where the connection between the levee and Chicago politics was no longer hidden behind a private door. The First Ward Ball took the relationships that normally operated through envelopes, saloons, and quiet agreements and placed them together in one crowded hall. Once each year, the private arrangements of the First Ward became public. The saloon keepers, brothel owners, gamblers, police officers, ward workers, businessmen, politicians, entertainers, and curious visitors who normally dealt with one another behind closed doors gathered beneath the same roof. They bought tickets from the same organisation, drank from the same supply, and watched Bathhouse John Coughlin lead them across the floor as though the levee had decided to hold its own civic parade. The event was formally presented as the annual reception and masquerade of the First Ward Democratic Organisation. Most Chicagoans called it the First Ward Ball, others called it the Derby. Whatever name appeared on the ticket, its real purpose was easy to understand. It raised campaign money for Coughlin and Michael Kenner, and it allowed every business dependent on their protection to demonstrate loyalty in a form that could be counted. The first ball was held in 1896 at the 7th Regiment Armoury. Reports from the period described a mixture of politicians, police officials, gamblers, prostitutes, saloon keepers, ward workers, and respectable visitors who had come to observe people they would normally pretend not to know. The organisers reportedly cleared about $25,000 from that first event, a remarkable return for a local political fundraiser. As the crowd increased in later years, the ball moved into the Chicago Coliseum on South Wabash Avenue, one of the largest indoor gathering places in the city. A ticket did more than admit one person to a dance. For an ordinary customer, it purchased entrance. For the owner of a levee business, it could function as evidence of cooperation. A saloon keeper might buy a book of tickets, a brothel owner might buy dozens. A businessman seeking help with a city matter could purchase more than he intended to use. The important question was not whether every ticket holder attended. The important question was whether the ward organisation knew who had paid. The system was effective because it made protection money resemble political fundraising. Coughlin and Kenner did not send every business owner an invoice-marked payment for police immunity. They sold tickets to a public event. The transaction could be explained as support for the Democratic organisation, loyalty to the alderman, or participation in a popular ward tradition. Everyone involved understood that refusing to participate could have consequences, but the money entered the machine through a respectable-looking door. This method also reduced the need for direct threats. An owner who depended on police tolerance did not need to be told repeatedly that buying tickets was wise. The condition of operating in the levee was already clear. Businesses that remained friendly to the machine expected warning before raids, assistance with licenses and access to officials. Businesses that became uncooperative could discover that the law had suddenly recovered its eyesight. In the weeks before the ball, tickets circulated through saloons, gambling rooms, brothels, hotels, political clubs and offices. Ward workers kept track of sales. Owners passed tickets to employees, customers, friends and associates. Some people bought them to protect a business. Others bought them because attendance had become fashionable. A man could condemn the levee in public and still decide that missing the ball would leave him outside an important social and political network. That contradiction filled the Coliseum. The building stood near 15th Street and Wabash Avenue. Its large interior had space for political conventions, sporting events, exhibitions, and crowds numbering in the thousands. National political parties would use it for conventions. On the night of the First Ward Ball, the same hall became an enlarged version of the district of the South. Police officers were assigned to the building in large numbers, but they were not there to close the event. They controlled entrances, dealt with fights, and tried to prevent the crowd from becoming completely unmanageable. Their uniforms also gave the gathering an appearance of official supervision. An event financed partly by businesses that paid for police protection was itself protected by the police. Guests began arriving in the evening. Carriages and cabs stopped outside. Streetcars brought people from other neighbourhoods. Men from the levee came with women from the houses, dance halls and saloons. Politicians entered through the crowd and were recognised by ward workers. Reporters arrived because the ball had become too large to ignore. Respectable spectators came wearing masks or costumes that allowed them to claim anonymity while making certain they saw everything. The mask served several purposes. A masquerade was part of the official entertainment, but concealment was useful at an event attended by men with families, employers, church memberships, or public reputations. A visitor could tell himself that nobody would know him beneath a false moustache, a hood, or a decorated mask. He could also remove the disguise when he wanted an alderman to notice that he had attended. Women appeared in theatrical costumes, evening dresses, riding clothes, uniforms, and outfits chosen to attract attention. Men came dressed as soldiers, clowns, labourers, women, rural visitors, criminals, or public figures. Some costumes were expensive, others were assembled from rented clothing, or whatever could be found in a theatre wardrobe. The crowd included professional entertainers and people accustomed to appearing on stage, so the line between guest and performer was never firm. Period newspapers paid particular attention to men wearing women's clothing. Reform writers described them with disgust and used their presence as evidence that the event had abandoned every accepted social boundary. Those reports reveal as much about the prejudices of the reporters as they do about the people they observed. Chicago already contained networks of men who met in saloons, clubs, theatres, and entertainment districts despite laws and social hostility. The ball offered a rare, crowded space where gender disguise could be worn openly, although never without the risk of ridicule or arrest elsewhere in the city. The levee's women entered under a different kind of attention. Some arrived with madams or groups from particular establishments. Their dresses and behaviour became part of the spectacle expected by spectators. A woman who worked all year as the attraction inside a resort became part of the attraction inside the Colosseum as well. That did not mean she attended only because an owner ordered her to go. The ball offered music, crowds, alcohol, dancing, and a chance to leave the normal rooms of the district. Some participants likely enjoyed it. Others treated attendance as work. Many experienced both at once. A woman might dance, drink, laugh with friends, attract customers, advertise her house, and satisfy the political expectations of her employer during the same evening. The Grand March gave the event its central ceremony. Bathhouse John Coughlin served as its most visible figure. He wore formal clothing made louder by coloured waistcoats, gloves, cravats, sashes, and other details that reporters described carefully, because Coughlin dressed as though understatement were a personal enemy. Floor managers wearing badges arranged the procession while bands prepared to play. Coughlin enjoyed this responsibility. City council meetings required him to sit among other aldermen. The ball placed him in the centre of thousands of people whose presence confirmed his political importance. When he gave the signal, the music began and the crowd moved around the floor. One song associated with the procession announced that the gang was present and did not care what anyone thought. The words were not subtle. They did not need to be. The purpose of the march was to show that Coughlin, Kenner, and the people who supported them remained in control despite years of criticism. Madams, politicians, ward employees, entertainers, police officials, saloon keepers, gamblers, and visitors moved through the same procession. Some wore badges identifying them as managers or committee members. Others marched because being seen near the aldermen increased their standing. The important people of the First Ward were not organised according to the rules respectable Chicago claimed to follow. A successful brothel owner could receive more attention than a minor office holder. A police captain might greet a gambling operator whose business he was officially expected to suppress. The ball did not destroy the social order of the ward for one night. It displayed the social order that already existed. Once the march ended, the hall became harder to control. Bands played from separate galleries. Dancing continued while waiters moved through the crowd carrying beer, wine, and champagne. Temporary bars and drinking areas handled thousands of orders. Tables and private boxes allowed wealthy guests and political figures to observe the floor while keeping some distance from it. That distance did not always last. Newspaper accounts described aldermen, businessmen, police officers, and members of the Levee crowd drinking together. Introductions were made. Favours were requested. Arguments began. Couples disappeared into corridors and less visible corners of the building. Pickpockets worked among people too distracted or drunk to protect their wallets. The presence of thieves was widely reported, but it was hardly surprising. A packed hall containing thousands of intoxicated guests, many carrying cash, watches, jewellery and ticket books, offered excellent working conditions. Police could arrest a few obvious offenders without threatening the event itself. The machine needed order sufficient to keep the ball operating, not order severe enough to make the ball respectable. Waiters reportedly competed for the chance to work because tips could be substantial. The job was difficult. They pushed through bodies carrying bottles and glasses, collected money, returned with change when they considered it necessary, and tried to keep tables supplied. Spilled beer spread across floors. Broken glass accumulated. Smoke from cigars and cigarettes thickened the air. The temperature rose as more people entered. By the early 20th century, attendance estimates reached 15,000 or more. A Chicago Tribune report on the 1907 ball claimed that roughly 20,000 people crowded into the Coliseum with 2 bands, approximately 200 waiters, and 100 police officers present. The same report estimated consumption at 10,000 quarts of champagne and 35,000 quarts of beer. Such figures were produced by newspapers describing a notorious event and should not be treated as precise accounting, but they show the scale contemporaries believed the ball had reached. The Colosseum was not designed to make 20,000 drinking people comfortable. Galleries filled, boxes became crowded, corridors were blocked, guests stood in rows behind seats and along railings. People trying to cross the main floor could be carried by the movement of the crowd, rather than walking in the direction they intended. Reports claim that intoxicated guests sometimes could not fall when they fainted because surrounding bodies held them upright. Women who lost consciousness were passed above the crowd toward exits. These stories may have been sharpened for readers, but the physical danger of the gathering was real. A fire, panic, or rush toward a door could have produced a disaster. The organisers continued selling admission because every additional person meant more money. The ball was often described as a night without rules, but rules still existed. A person generally needed a ticket. Staff guarded entrances. Police removed some fighters. The bars operated according to licensing arrangements, even when closing times were tested. Ward leaders expected employees and supporters to protect the event from anything that might force an immediate shutdown. The rules were designed to preserve revenue and political authority. They were not designed to protect every person inside. A woman separated from her group could be surrounded or assaulted. Newspaper accounts described men pulling at women's costumes and attempting to remove clothing. Fights could begin over insults, jealousy, stolen property, or unwanted attention. One widely repeated incident from the 1908 ball involved a Levee madam known as French Annie, stabbing her male companion with a hatpin during a dispute. The story became part of the ball's legend because it gave reporters one clear act of violence to place inside a much larger scene of disorder. The police made surprisingly few arrests compared with the size of the crowd, and the conduct described in newspapers. That was another sign of the event's political protection. Similar behaviour in a dance hall without powerful sponsors could lead to a raid, loss of a licence, or multiple arrests. At the first ward ball, officers generally intervened only when a disturbance could not be ignored. The uneven enforcement was visible to everyone. A young man arrested for drunkenness on an ordinary street could enter the Coliseum and watch thousands of people drink under police supervision. A woman arrested for solicitation outside the tolerated district could see Levee madams welcomed into the Grand March. A saloon owner cited for violating closing rules could purchase ball tickets from the organisation whose allies influenced those rules. The event did not merely celebrate vice, it celebrated the ability to decide when vice would be punished. Kenner usually watched the proceedings with less visible excitement than Coughlin. He was not the natural leader of a costume parade. His satisfaction came from the attendance, ticket sales, and evidence of loyalty. Every filled box represented relationships. Every book of tickets purchased by an owner represented a contribution. Every politician who appeared confirmed that the First Ward organisation could not be dismissed as an isolated collection of saloons and brothels. Prominent visitors faced a choice. They could avoid the ball and risk offending men who controlled an important ward. They could attend openly and be associated with the levee. They could enter wearing masks, remain in a private box, or send representatives. The machine benefited from every option, except complete refusal. Reporters took special pleasure in identifying respectable men who had come only to observe. Newspapers understood that readers enjoyed moral outrage most when familiar names were involved. Some publications threatened to print lists of attendees. The threat itself became part of the entertainment, increasing curiosity while allowing newspapers to claim that they were discouraging attendance. This relationship between press coverage and the ball was complicated. Critical stories damaged Chicago's reputation and strengthened reform campaigns, but they also advertised the event. Descriptions of costumes, famous guests, enormous crowds, and shocking conduct encouraged people to attend the following year. A report written to condemn the ball could function as a promotional notice. Coughlin and Kenner understood this effect. Public attacks allowed them to present themselves as defenders of ordinary Chicago against ministers, civic reformers, and upper-class moral guardians. Kenner argued that critics exaggerated the disorder. Coughlin responded with jokes and short verses. Their supporters treated condemnation as proof that the ball remained important. The event offered wealthy thrill-seekers a controlled visit to the underworld. They could spend several hours among people described as dangerous, then leave in a cab and return to another part of the city. They did not have to live near the levee, face repeated police arrests, or depend on a brothel owner for income. The risk was temporary, which made it exciting. The people from the district could not leave their positions so easily. When the lights came up and the music stopped, the madames returned to their houses, the women returned to the rooms where they worked, the saloon keepers reopened their businesses, and the ward employees continued collecting favours and votes. The ball ended, but the protection system it financed continued. By 1908, the event had become too large to remain only a local scandal. Newspapers outside Chicago reported on it. Reform organisations used it as evidence that city government had become publicly allied with the vice trade. The spectacle no longer supported the argument that the levee was being quietly contained for practical reasons. There was nothing quiet about 20,000 people in the Colosseum. Opposition began before the 1908 ball opened. Protestant ministers, the Law and Order League, and women's organisations pressed Mayor Fred Buss to deny permission for liquor sales. Reformers warned that young men and women entered from curiosity and were exposed to crime, exploitation, and public drunkenness. Coughlin and Kenner answered that the event had been misrepresented and invited critics to observe it themselves. The protest increased interest. Advertisements announced that the ball would proceed on December 14th. People arrived in such numbers that thousands were reportedly still trying to enter around midnight. The Chicago Examiner described it as the 11th annual insult to those who remained away, language intended to condemn both the organisers and the crowd. Inside, Bathhouse John again led the march. The bands played. Drinking continued. The balconies filled with spectators. Period accounts described empty champagne bottles stacked in piles, fights across the building, men tearing at women's clothing, and scenes that newspapers claimed could not be printed in full. Coughlin and Kenner called the event a success because it drew a record crowd and produced the intended revenue. That success created a problem the alderman could not solve with another ticket sale. The ball had shown the protection system too clearly. It placed elected officials at the head of a procession containing the owners and employees of businesses those officials were supposed to regulate. Police officers guarded the gathering. Major business interests purchased tickets. Respectable spectators filled the galleries. No one could continue claiming that the levee survived only because the city had failed to notice it. The city had attended its fundraiser. In 1909, pressure on Mayor Bussey intensified. Reformers demanded that the annual gathering be stopped. The administration refused the liquor permission required for the usual event. Without alcohol, dancing, and the profitable disorder that attracted the crowd, the First Ward Ball could not operate in its familiar form. Coughlin responded with a short announcement that became one of his best-known pieces of verse. "No ball, that's all." The alderman attempted to replace it with a sober concert at the Colosseum. Rows of chairs were fixed to the floor. A classical orchestra performed. Only a few thousand people appeared, and many reportedly stayed only long enough to make certain ward leaders had seen them. The event ended by 11 in the evening. The machine had demonstrated that it could require attendance, but it could not manufacture enthusiasm without the features reformers had forced it to remove. The loss of the ball did not immediately end Coughlin and Kenner's political careers. It did not close the levee, stop protection payments, or eliminate prostitution. It did show that organised public pressure could force the city to withdraw support from one of the district's most visible institutions. Reformers had learned something useful. Attacking individual brothels produced temporary raids. Attacking the public reputation of Chicago could move mayors, newspapers, business organisations, churches and women's clubs into the same campaign. The ball had made corruption easy to see. The next task was to expose what happened on ordinary nights, when there was no grand march, no crowded Colosseum, and no alderman wearing a sash in the centre of the floor. Investigators began gathering names, addresses, financial records, police testimony, medical evidence, and accounts from women inside the trade. They intended to prove that the Vice District was not controlled, not safe, and not necessary, and their campaign would soon place the entire levee under a level of examination it had never faced before. The people who wanted the First Ward Ball stopped understood that ending one public event would not dismantle the system behind it. Coughlin and Kenner still controlled the ward organisation. Police officers still decided which doors to enter and which ones to pass. Brothel owners still paid rent, bought alcohol, hired employees, and contributed money to political organisations. Customers still arrived every evening. Reformers needed evidence that could survive beyond a sermon, a newspaper headline, or a single police raid. They did not belong to one organisation and did not always agree with one another. Ministers approached the levee as a moral problem. Physicians emphasised venereal disease. Settlement workers saw low wages, unsafe housing, and the lack of recreation available to young people. Women's organisations focused on children, employment agencies, dance halls, and the unequal treatment of women under the law. Business leaders worried that corruption damaged Chicago's national reputation. Lawyers wanted stronger prosecutions against procurers and property owners. Some reformers demanded immediate closure. Others initially believed that segregation and regulation might be the only practical policy for a city of Chicago's size. Their shared conclusion developed slowly. By the end of the 19th century, Chicago already had organisations investigating gambling, alcohol, child labour, political corruption, and prostitution. Women connected to Hull House and other settlements visited courtrooms, factories, lodging houses, theatres, dance halls, and neighbourhoods that elected officials rarely entered except during campaigns. They gathered information by speaking to residents, rather than relying entirely on police reports. The Juvenile Protective Association became particularly important. The women-led organisation grew from the movement that created the Cook County Juvenile Court and established its headquarters at Hull House. Under the leadership of Louise de Koven Bowen, its investigators examined dance halls, inexpensive theatres, saloons, employment agencies, and other places where working-class children and young adults spent time. The association believed that children were being drawn toward crime and prostitution through unsafe amusements, poor supervision, poverty, and the absence of affordable alternatives. Investigators did not remain in offices waiting for complaints. They attended performances, counted children working after legal hours, observed conditions in amusement halls, and filed reports with public authorities. In 1 year, officers associated with the organisation made more than 700 visits to 5-cent theatres while checking whether children were being illegally employed at night. Their work established a method that later vice investigators would use on a larger scale: enter the place, record what happened, compare it with the law, and ask why officials had allowed the violation to continue. The reformers also discovered that the geography of vice exposed black families to conditions that white neighbourhoods had successfully pushed away. Investigations found black women working as maids in brothels after employment agencies refused to send white women to the same houses. Black girls faced discrimination in respectable employment and were more likely to be directed into domestic work under dangerous conditions. The Juvenile Protective Association later documented the unequal treatment of black Chicagoans in employment, policing, courts, housing, and recreation. This did not mean progressive reform organisations were free from the racial beliefs of their period. Many reports used paternalistic language. Investigators sometimes treated black residents as objects of study, rather than partners with their own political demands. They could condemn discrimination while still assuming that middle-class white reformers should decide what protection looked like. Even so, their records exposed an important fact: the levee had not been placed near black neighbourhoods by accident. City policy repeatedly moved vice toward communities with less power to resist it. Another campaign focused on what newspapers called white slavery. The phrase referred to women and girls forced or deceived into prostitution, but it was also used so broadly that it encouraged exaggeration. Popular stories often described innocent white women kidnapped by foreign men and imprisoned in brothels. Those stories drew attention and money, but they could hide the more common methods of control, including false job offers, debt, pressure from intimate partners, threats, low wages, and the lack of housing or family support. In 1909, Jewish civic organisations, the Commercial Club, churches and other groups supported a campaign led by former Assistant State's Attorney Clifford Rowe. Rowe had prosecuted pandering cases and argued that procurers used dance halls, employment promises, and personal relationships to recruit women. The campaign raised substantial funds and promised to investigate trafficking, rescue victims, and prosecute the men who profited from them. Contemporary reports connected the effort directly to Chicago's vice districts. Police corruption was already becoming harder to dismiss. In September 1909, Police Inspector Edward McCann was convicted of taking protection money from saloon owners in a West Side vice district. State's Attorney John E. Wayman used the case to show that corruption was not merely an accusation made by ministers. A senior police official had been found guilty of collecting money from businesses he was responsible for supervising. Each investigation revealed part of the system, but no organisation possessed the authority or resources to examine the entire city. Mayor Fred Buss responded in March 1910 by appointing a municipal vice commission. The body was later formalised through city council action and public funding. 30 members were selected from religion, medicine, law, education, social work, business and civic reform. They included Dean Walter T. Sumner, who became chairman, business leader Julius Rosenwald, social worker Graham Taylor, club leader Ellen Martin Henritine, physicians Anna Dwyer and W. A. Evans, judges Harry Olson and Merritt Pinckney, academics William the High, Thomas and Herbert Willett, and representatives from Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, and African Methodist Episcopal institutions. The membership was designed to give the commission public legitimacy. A report signed only by ministers could be dismissed as religious agitation, One produced only by physicians might be reduced to a discussion of disease. Business leaders, judges, academics, clergy, doctors, and women reformers placed together could claim to represent a broader portion of Chicago. They still entered the work with assumptions. Several members initially thought a restricted district might be preferable to prostitution scattered through residential areas. Segregation appeared practical because it promised police supervision and geographic control. The question was whether Chicago's existing districts had achieved either result. The Commission divided its work among committees examining conditions inside the levee, police conduct, saloons, procurers, women's wages, children, medical consequences, rescue institutions, and the laws available to the city. A planning meeting in May 1910 assigned subjects including bondage in the vice districts and the relationship between prostitution, saloons, and police. The committee's subjects overlapped so heavily that the final publication was assembled as one report rather than a collection of separate findings. The commissioners understood that official testimony would not be enough. Police commanders could provide lists of known brothels and insist that conditions were under control. Saloon keepers could deny that women solicited customers in their establishments. Hotel owners could claim they rented rooms without knowing what happened in them. Brothel keepers could present carefully selected women and describe their houses as well managed. The commission hired George J. Neeland as Director of Investigation. Neeland had social work experience and had supervised field investigations for New York's Committee of 14. Under his direction, trained male and female investigators entered saloons, hotels, dance halls, brothels, amusement venues and flats used for prostitution. They wrote daily reports describing conversations, prices, employees, customers, police behaviour, and the physical arrangement of the businesses. Their presence inside the levee was not announced. An investigator might enter a saloon as an ordinary customer, order a drink, and wait to see whether a woman approached him. Another might ask a cab driver for a recommendation. A female investigator could apply for employment, speak with women in lodging houses, or examine the work of an employment agency. Teams compared what they observed with addresses supplied by the police. The reports removed the protections created by official language. A place described in municipal records as a saloon might contain women soliciting customers in a rear room. A hotel could rent rooms for short visits, while its proprietor claimed no knowledge of prostitution. A flat could use the telephone to bring women and customers together without maintaining a permanent group of residents. Dance halls could direct couples toward nearby rooms. The businesses were separated on paper while operating as a connected system. Investigators examined 445 saloons across Chicago and counted 929 unescorted women whose conduct led them to believe they were prostitutes. They reported direct solicitation by more than 236 women in 236 different saloons. Most of those women directed customers toward rooms, hotels or brothels in or above the same buildings. The commission concluded that many saloon owners were using prostitution to increase alcohol sales. The inquiry into police knowledge produced even more damaging results. Police inspectors supplied a list containing 1,825 women at 374 addresses in districts where prostitution was officially tolerated. Commission investigators independently visited 150 vice locations in the same territory. Only 45 appeared on the police list. The other 105 did not. They also examined 275 saloons used for immoral purposes and found that only 46 appeared on the police list, leaving 229 that police records had omitted. Those discrepancies created two possible explanations. Police commanders either did not understand what was happening in districts they were paid to supervise, or they knew and had chosen not to record it. Neither answer supported the claim that segregation allowed effective regulation. The commission asked police officials to prepare another list and compared it again with field observations. Large differences remained. Investigators also reported officers drinking with women, giving customers directions to houses, ignoring open violations, and treating tolerated districts as though police regulations had replaced state law. The final report avoided accusing the entire department of corruption, but it condemned a system that made selective enforcement normal and created opportunities for graft. The commissioners did not publish the real names of offenders, exact addresses, or badge numbers in the report. Businesses and officers were identified through coded references such as the letter X followed by a number. The original information remained in commission files. This decision reduced the danger of libel actions and supported the claim that the inquiry was scientific rather than sensational, but it frustrated readers who wanted immediate prosecutions. The commission had been created to investigate and recommend. It had no prosecuting authority. Entering the district also changed the commissioner's understanding of its scale. Police lists saloon investigations and field reports led them to estimate that approximately 5,000 professional prostitutes worked in Chicago. They did not attempt to count women engaged in occasional or concealed prostitution because reliable figures were unavailable. The commission identified more than 4,000 women through combined police and investigative records and added an estimate for those missed because of limited time and funding. The report estimated that the commercialized vice business generated more than $15 million each year. Investigators based the figure on business records, court exhibits, rent, alcohol sales, prices charged to customers, and testimony from owners and workers. They argued that the trade was controlled largely by male exploiters, property owners, saloon interests, pimps, and political protectors rather than by the women whose earnings supported it. That conclusion challenged the public image of the independent madam running a private house. Famous women such as Ada and Minna Everly were real business owners, but they represented only one part of the market. Behind many establishments stood male landlords charging inflated rent, saloon owners profiting from drinks, procurers taking earnings, and political organizations collecting money for protection. Respectable property owners received particular criticism. A landlord did not need to enter the levee at night to profit from it. He could lease a building at a price far above its ordinary value and claim that the tenant was responsible for what happened inside. The commission treated those rents as a share of the vice economy. A person could maintain a clean public reputation while receiving income made possible by prostitution. The investigation of women's employment pushed the report beyond police raids. Commissioners examined wages in department stores, factories, restaurants, domestic service, and other occupations open to women. They did not claim that every poorly paid woman entered prostitution. They did argue that low pay increased vulnerability by making it difficult to afford food, clothing, rent, and transportation. A saleswoman might be expected to dress neatly while receiving wages that did not cover respectable clothing. A domestic servant could lose both income and housing when dismissed. A factory worker who became ill might have no savings. The levee offered immediate money, and recruiters understood how to approach women during moments of financial pressure. Jane Addams was not a member of the commission, but her work and the investigations associated with Hull House shaped the larger discussion. She argued that prostitution had to be examined through economic conditions, social isolation, dangerous amusements, and the treatment of young women arriving in cities. Her approach did not excuse exploitation, but it rejected the idea that individual moral failure explained the entire system. The Juvenile Protective Association's studies of theatres, dance halls, courts, employment, and neighbourhood conditions provided the Commission with evidence about the environment surrounding young people. The Commissioners also listened to women in prostitution. These interviews did not give the women control over the report, and their words were filtered through investigators who already had strong views. Still, the testimony complicated popular stories. Some women described coercion or false promises. Others discussed poverty, family conflict, abuse, drug use, or relationships with men who took their earnings. Some had entered after working in legal occupations. Others rejected rescue offers because the institutions available to them imposed strict discipline while providing little income. The section on rescue and reform examined homes intended to remove women from prostitution. Investigators found that moral instruction alone could not solve the problem. A woman leaving a brothel needed housing, work, medical treatment, and a way to avoid returning to the same men or businesses. Training her only for domestic service might place her in another poorly paid and dependent position. Medical investigators emphasised syphilis and gonorrhea, for which no simple antibiotic cure existed. The Commission rejected claims that periodic examinations made prostitution safe. A woman could be examined, declared healthy, and still carry an infection that was not visible. Customers were not subjected to the same system, and men could transmit disease to wives and children after leaving the district. 5 physicians served on the commission, and medical concerns occupied a major section of the final report. Their language was often severe. Disease, heredity, morality, and fears about the future of the population were combined in ways common to progressive reform. Some arguments reflected the era's interest in eugenics and social control. The report also condemned homosexuality, using terms now recognised as hostile and inaccurate. Investigators treated gay men and gender non-conforming performers in the levee as evidence of moral disorder rather than people building a community under dangerous conditions. These prejudices did not erase the evidence of political protection, exploitation, and unequal enforcement. They do require us to read the report carefully. Progressive reformers could expose real abuse while demanding more surveillance. They could defend children while restricting working-class amusements. They could condemn the placement of vice in black neighbourhoods while using racial assumptions of their own. They wanted to protect vulnerable people, but they also wanted to control behaviour they considered improper. Months of investigation changed the Commission's position on segregation. Members who had initially viewed a restricted district as a practical compromise concluded that it had failed. Vice had not remained inside the levee. Saloon solicitation, assignation hotels, flats, and telephone-based arrangements already operated throughout Chicago. The restricted district had not eliminated prostitution elsewhere. It had created a protected commercial centre while encouraging police to treat illegal tolerance as policy. The Commission's final recommendation was persistent repression of public prostitution, with complete abolition as the stated goal. It proposed a permanent morals commission, a specialised morals court, stronger police administration, action against assignation hotels, separation of prostitution from saloons, improved recreation for children, sex education, medical measures, and changes in the rescue system. The published report contained 96 recommendations rather than a single demand for raids. This broad programme reflected a disagreement within reform itself. Closing a brothel was simple compared with addressing wages, housing, alcohol, police corruption, public health, and discrimination. Some activists wanted the doors shut immediately. Social workers warned that repression without economic and social changes would move the trade into less visible locations. Critics of the Commission argued that its goal of complete annihilation could not be achieved, and that closing known houses might scatter prostitution into residential neighbourhoods. The report was published in 1911 under the title The Social Evil in Chicago. It contained hundreds of pages of statistics, case summaries, descriptions of establishments, legal analysis, medical discussion, and recommendations. Its tone was official and restrained compared with sensational newspaper campaigns, but its central accusation was direct. Chicago had not regulated the levee. Chicago had allowed a commercial business to operate through selective law enforcement and political influence. The Commission signed its conclusions unanimously. That agreement gave the report weight. Clergy, physicians, judges, business leaders, academics, and social reformers had begun with different priorities and reached the same decision. The restricted district should not continue. Coughlin, Kenner, saloon owners and brothel keepers could dismiss individual ministers as moral fanatics. It was harder to dismiss a city-funded commission containing judges, doctors, university professors, and the president of Sears, Roebuck. Newspapers distributed its findings. Civic groups organised meetings. Churches used its statistics. Reformers carried copies to officials who had spent years claiming they lacked reliable information. The levee remained open while those arguments spread. Music still came from the resorts. Customers continued arriving. Owners continued paying rent and protection. The Everleigh Club remained in business, confident that its wealth, reputation and connections separated it from cheaper houses. The difference was that Chicago's officials could no longer say they did not know. Names, addresses, police numbers, financial estimates, and field reports had been collected. The report had identified the saloons, hotels, landlords, officers, and political conditions that kept the system operating. A commission could not close the doors, but prosecutors and police could, provided someone ordered them to act and accepted the political consequences. Attention now shifted from the investigators who had entered the levee to the officials who would decide whether the evidence remained on a shelf. State's Attorney John Wayman was preparing a more direct campaign, Mayor Carter Harrison was returning to office, and the most famous houses on 22nd Street were about to learn how quickly official tolerance could disappear once protecting them became more expensive than shutting them down. The Vice Commission's report did not close a single door by itself. It gave Chicago's officials evidence, recommendations, and a public reason to act. But the city still had to decide whether it was willing to enforce laws it had ignored for years. That decision was not made at once. When Carter Harrison Jr. returned to the mayor's office in 1911, he inherited a system his earlier administrations had helped maintain. Harrison had previously pushed visible prostitution away from streets where it interfered with respectable commerce, while leaving the newer levee largely undisturbed. He was not unfamiliar with the argument for segregation. Many officials still believed that prostitution could not be eliminated and was safer when concentrated in a known district. The Vice Commission had directly challenged that belief. Its investigators found that prostitution was already operating outside the levee through saloons, hotels, flats, dance halls, and private arrangements. The district had not contained vice, it had created a protected centre for it. Commission members who had initially considered segregation practical concluded that the city should abandon the policy and permanently abolish its tolerated districts. Harrison now faced pressure from churches, civic organisations, women's groups, newspapers, business leaders, and officials who wanted the report followed by action. He also faced aldermen, resort owners, saloon keepers, landlords, police officers, and political organisations that had benefited from the existing arrangement. Closing the entire levee immediately would have required a direct conflict with all of them. The mayor began with a target that almost everyone recognised. The Everleigh Club was not the largest source of suffering in the district. It was not the cheapest, most violent, or most dependent on rapid business. It was the most famous. Its name appeared in newspapers across the country. Its owners had advertised its expensive furnishings, music, food, and wealthy customers so successfully that the establishment had become a symbol of Chicago's tolerance. That fame had protected the club when the political arrangement was stable. It made the club vulnerable once the arrangement began to collapse. Ada and Minna Everleigh had tried to separate themselves from the district's cheaper houses. They claimed to maintain strict standards, reject drunken or violent men, pay women well, and provide cleaner surroundings. Their public image depended on presenting the club as an exception. Reformers saw the matter differently. If Chicago allowed its most visible brothel to remain open after publishing hundreds of pages on commercialized vice, the city would appear unwilling to act against any establishment with enough money and political influence. In October 1911, The Everleigh sisters were ordered to close. There was no long siege at the entrance. No army of police had to break through the doors. The sisters understood that the protection on which their business depended had been withdrawn. They announced that they would obey the mayor's order. The club closed after more than a decade of operation, and the women who worked there had to leave or find employment elsewhere. The Vice Commission report had helped produce the first major symbolic closure of the reform campaign. Newspapers treated the shutdown as a major victory. The most famous house in the levee was no longer accepting customers. Reporters described furniture being removed, rooms being emptied, and the building losing the activity that had made it nationally known. The closure was important, but it was also useful theatre. The city had shut one establishment whose name everyone knew. Hundreds of other businesses connected to prostitution continued operating. A customer arriving on 22nd Street after the Everleigh closed did not find the district deserted. He found fewer lights at one address. Saloons remained open. Dance halls continued. Cheap houses still received customers. Hotels rented rooms. Guides and cab drivers adjusted their recommendations. The market did not depend on one club. Even the Everleigh women did not disappear from Chicago because the building closed. Some left the trade, some moved to other houses, others worked independently or through less visible arrangements. Closing a workplace did not provide housing, wages, medical care, or a respectable employer willing to overlook a woman's history. The city had removed the best-known sign without removing the system behind it. State's Attorney John E. W. Wayman occupied an uncertain position in the campaign. He had prosecuted police corruption and supported laws against pandering, but he had also questioned whether complete suppression was possible. Like many officials, he understood that closing known districts might scatter prostitution into neighbourhoods where it would be harder to police. Reformers had heard this argument for years. By 1912, they were no longer willing to accept it as a reason for delay. Public demonstrations increased. Religious organisations held meetings and marches. Ministers devoted sermons and prayers to the destruction of the red light districts. Speakers accused elected officials of protecting vice. Women's groups demanded that the city enforce its own laws. Wayman became a particular target. His term as state's attorney was approaching its end, and political opponents could claim that he had allowed Chicago's most notorious district to continue, despite having prosecutorial authority. His response changed the pace of enforcement. Wayman obtained warrants for 135 people associated with vice resorts, about 100 of them in the Southside Levee. The warrants were initially given to local police stations. Only a small number were served. Police reported that many of the people named could not be found, even though some operated businesses known throughout the district. Wayman took back the unserved warrants, added more, and placed them in the hands of detectives under his own control. His instruction was direct: raid every place found open. The resulting operation was unlike the limited raids to which levee owners had become accustomed. Detectives entered houses, arrested keepers and workers, loaded patrol wagons, delivered prisoners to police stations, and returned for more. Crowds followed the raids through the district. Some spectators treated the operation as entertainment. Others entered closed establishments and stole furniture, alcohol, or anything they could carry. The city police remained separate from parts of the campaign, producing an unusual scene in which county prosecutors attacked businesses that municipal officers had tolerated. Wayman announced that disorderly houses would remain closed through the end of his term. For the people arrested, the raids did not look like an orderly reform program. Women were removed from houses and taken to stations. Owners searched for lawyers and bondsmen. Employees who had depended on the businesses for food and shelter suddenly had neither. Customers disappeared as soon as they understood that police wagons had replaced cabs near the entrances. The crowds made the situation more dangerous. Young men followed the officers, shouted at women being arrested, and entered buildings after the occupants had been removed. Reformers had argued that the levee exploited women, but a mass raid could expose those same women to public humiliation without giving them a safe place to go. This was one of the central weaknesses of suppression. Closing a brothel was easier than supporting the people who had lived or worked there. Some reform organisations operated rescue homes and employment programmes. Their capacity was limited. The institutions could be strict, religious, and controlling. A woman might be required to surrender personal freedom, perform domestic labour, follow a schedule, and accept training for work that paid far less than prostitution. Other women had no interest in entering such institutions. They rented rooms, contacted former customers, joined another establishment, or left Chicago. Some returned to partners who took their earnings. Others found work in restaurants, factories, laundries, domestic service, or entertainment. The raids still changed the district. An open brothel depended on routine. Customers needed to know that the door would be open. Employees needed to believe that they could remain in the building. Owners needed enough stability to pay rent, buy supplies, and compensate political protectors. Repeated raids destroyed that routine even when prosecutions ended with small fines or dismissed charges. A house that reopened could be raided again. A customer who feared having his name printed in a newspaper chose another location. A landlord worried that reformers would publicise his ownership. A saloon keeper decided that open solicitation was no longer worth the risk. The levee began to lose the confidence that had made it profitable. There was no single evening when every light went out at the same moment. The district's closure occurred through a series of orders, raids, prosecutions, injunctions, licensing actions, and public campaigns between 1911 and 1914. The Everleigh Club closed in 1911. Raids virtually shut down the concentrated levee in 1912. Some houses reopened. Reform committees and police actions continued attacking the remaining businesses. Later testimony indicated that hundreds of houses had returned by 1913, before another campaign exposed property owners and forced many buildings to close. This is why historical accounts sometimes give different dates for the end of the levee. The district was functionally broken in 1912, but remnants continued. Freiburg's dance hall and other establishments survived longer than the major brothels. Municipal authorities kept applying pressure through 1913 and 1914. The name remained in use even after the compact system that had made the neighbourhood famous had been disrupted. A reformer visiting after a major raid could reasonably declare that the levee had closed. A customer who knew the correct address could still find business nearby. The city's success depended on what was being measured. Chicago had ended the open concentration of large brothels operating with obvious political protection. It had not ended the exchange of sex for money. The distinction was visible in the buildings. An old resort might stand empty for a time, then be converted into apartments, lodging rooms, or another business. Furniture and fixtures were sold. Signs came down. Pianos disappeared from rooms where music had played every evening. Landlords looked for tenants who would not attract reform investigators. Nearby streets did not become respectable immediately. Saloons, cheap hotels, cabarets, and gambling operations remained. The same transportation routes still brought visitors through the area. Poverty, low wages, racial segregation, and political corruption continued. The levee had been a convenient address for a much larger business. Once that address became dangerous, the business adopted other methods. One of the most important was the call house flat. Instead of keeping several women in a large brothel marked by bright lights and constant visitors, an operator used an ordinary apartment or rented room. A customer arrived and found no one openly waiting. A woman was summoned by telephone from another location. This arrangement reduced the evidence visible from the street. Neighbours might notice visitors, but there was no grand entrance, music, or group of employees. Police could not identify the business simply by walking past it. The operator needed a telephone, contacts, and people willing to bring customers and women together. Taxi drivers, hotel clerks, saloon keepers, pimps, and guides became even more valuable. A customer no longer asked for the levee. He asked a driver, bartender, or porter for a number or private address. The telephone and automobile weakened the geographic limits on prostitution. A woman could be contacted from several neighbourhoods. A customer could travel quickly to an apartment far from the old district. An operator could move after a complaint without losing the entire network. Historians of Chicago's vice districts identify callhouse flats, telephones, automobiles, pimps, taxi drivers, and saloon keepers as central to the scattering that followed the Levee raids. The new system made the trade less visible to reformers and more difficult for workers to monitor as well. Inside a large house, women lived under the control of an owner, but they also worked near other women, servants, musicians, and employees. An independent apartment offered more privacy and sometimes more control over earnings. It could also leave a woman alone with a violent customer and no staff nearby. The Levee's disappearance did not produce one new model. It produced many smaller arrangements. Hotels became important because they offered rooms without requiring a permanent brothel. A customer and woman could enter separately. The hotel keeper could deny knowledge. A clerk could accept money for cooperation, while the owner maintained that the building was legitimate. Cabarets and nightclubs offered another route. Men and women could meet through dancing, drinking, music, and entertainment. A transaction did not have to begin with open solicitation. A woman might be employed as performer, hostess, or drink seller while also meeting customers. The boundary between nightlife and prostitution remained as difficult to define as it had been in the dance halls of the Levee. During the 1920s, commercial sex became increasingly connected to cabarets, nightclubs, hotels, and other institutions of nighttime leisure. These businesses were distributed across the city rather than concentrated in one openly tolerated brothel district. The relocation placed new pressure on black neighbourhoods. Chicago's black population was growing rapidly as migrants arrived from the South in search of work and greater personal freedom. Restrictive housing practices confined many families to a narrow section of the South Side known as the Black Belt. White property owners, police officers, and politicians then allowed vice businesses displaced from other areas to move into or near the same community. This repeated the method Chicago had used for decades. Vice was not eliminated. It was moved toward residents with less political power to keep it away. Black reformers protested the policy. Families objected to brothels, saloons, gambling rooms, and cabarets opening near homes and churches. They also objected to the assumption that black neighbourhoods were naturally suited to businesses white neighbourhoods had rejected. Police behaviour reinforced that inequality. Research into progressive-era Chicago has found that officials continued informally tolerating prostitution within certain South Side boundaries after the supposed end of segregation. White operators could hide businesses in black neighbourhoods, while public discussion treated the resulting vice as evidence of black disorder rather than a product of city policy and white investment. The women affected by this movement faced both racial discrimination and the dangers of illegal work. Black women had fewer legal employment opportunities, received lower wages, and were more likely to be ignored when reporting violence. White customers and business owners could enter the neighbourhood, profit, and leave. Police attention fell most heavily on the people who remained visible. The closed levee, therefore, did not distribute the consequences evenly. Respectable downtown Chicago gained distance from the scandal. Poorer South Side communities inherited more of it. The destruction of the concentrated district also encouraged a change in criminal organisation. The old levee contained many separate brothels, saloons, gambling rooms, and hotels operating under political protection. As the businesses scattered, owners needed reliable networks that could arrange police protection, control territory, supply workers, settle disputes, and move money between locations. Vice syndicates became increasingly important. Saloon keepers, hotel operators, club owners, pimps, and sex workers made arrangements with organisations capable of reducing police interference. The connection between prostitution, gambling, political corruption, and organised crime became less dependent on a few blocks around 22nd Street and more dependent on personal networks. Jim Colosimo had already demonstrated how valuable such coordination could be. He rose from connections in the Levee's protection system to become one of Chicago's leading vice operators. John Torrio later worked with him, and Al Capone arrived in Chicago near the beginning of Prohibition to join Torrio's organization. After Colosimo's murder in 1920, Torrio expanded into gambling, prostitution, and illegal liquor. Capone later inherited and enlarged that system. It would be too simple to say that closing the levee created Al Capone. Prohibition, political corruption, public demand for alcohol, gang competition, and existing criminal networks all mattered. The important connection is that Chicago had spent decades developing relationships among illegal business owners, police officers, politicians, saloon keepers, and collectors. The district closed. Those relationships remained useful. Coughlin and Kenner also survived the immediate destruction of the levee. Their most visible source of money had been damaged, but political machines did not depend on only one event or one group of businesses. They still had ward workers, party connections, voters, favours, and knowledge accumulated over many elections. Reformers had managed to end the First Ward Ball and break the open vice district, but they did not remove every official who had protected it. This was another reason the victory remained incomplete. The physical concentration disappeared more quickly than the political habits that had supported it. A visitor returning to 22nd Street several years later would have found a changed neighbourhood. The famous houses no longer operated with the same confidence. Buildings had new uses or stood vacant. The continuous movement of customers between brightly advertised resorts had ended. That visitor could have concluded that reform had succeeded. He would have been partly correct. The city had stopped openly designating a section of Chicago where brothels could operate under an informal agreement. It had removed a district whose owners treated police raids as a business inconvenience and political payments as a routine expense. It had shown that organised civic pressure could overcome ward protection when the political cost became high enough. Women were no longer displayed in the same number of large, easily identified houses. Customers no longer entered one neighbourhood certain that almost every need could be met within a few blocks. The First Ward machine could no longer hold a public ball where vice owners, police, and politicians marched together without serious consequences. Those were real changes. They did not solve the conditions the Vice Commission had documented. Women still received low wages in legal employment. Housing remained expensive. Domestic service remained insecure. Sexual violence continued. Venereal disease remained a major public health problem. Police still accepted money. Landlords still rented property for illegal uses. Customers still expected anonymity and rarely faced the punishment imposed on women. The city had attacked the visible organisation of prostitution more successfully than it attacked demand. A customer who once walked down 22nd Street now used a telephone. A brothel keeper became a hotel operator, cabaret owner, or manager of several flats. A political collector who once visited a row of houses made arrangements with a syndicate controlling businesses across several neighbourhoods. A woman who once lived in a known resort met customers through a saloon, hotel, dance hall, taxi driver, or private introduction. The levee had made commercial vice easy to map. Its destruction made the same business harder to see. That was the final result of Chicago's long attempt to contain its sins. The city first moved vice south, then concentrated it, protected it, investigated it, raided it, and declared the district closed. Each stage changed the streets without removing the reasons the market existed. By the middle of the 1910s, the levee as Chicago had known it was finished. Its grand houses, cheap resorts, public processions, and openly negotiated boundaries belonged to an earlier period of city government. The business survived because it no longer required the levee. It had learned to operate through telephones, automobiles, hotels, cabarets, private apartments, political contacts, and criminal organisations. Chicago had shut the doors it could see while the people behind them moved to new addresses. The red lights disappeared from 22nd Street. The arrangements that kept them burning moved elsewhere.